Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third presentation in the MiCorps Spring Webinar Series, Aquatic Food Webs and How Do Fish Decide What to Eat and Why. My name is Eric Elgin, and I'm an aquatic ecologist with MSU Extension and also the Program Manager for the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program of MiCorps. MiCorps is Michigan's Clean Water Corps and is our citizen science program for stream and lake monitoring. As you can see from the slide, we are in a webinar format. The chat function is off until the end of the program, where you can add additional material and commentary when we're in Q&A. And for your question and answer, there's the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's where you can ask questions. Feel free to enter them in throughout the presentation, and then we will have a nice Q&A a few minutes at the end of the presentation with our presenter. If you have any problems with your sound, please check that select a speaker on the bottom left of your screen. And if you have any other questions, you can contact MSU's help desk. Next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned before, the Michigan Clean Water Corps is Michigan's citizen science program for streams and lakes. This program of ours has three sections. The first one being the Volunteer Stream Monitoring Program. This is a great place for folks to get involved with monitoring stream water quality through looking at invertebrates and bugs in the water to learn about who lives there and what that tells us about the water quality, as well as evaluating habitat. This program works through local watershed groups, and then to all of us. Next slide. Also with streams is our MiCorps Volunteer Stream Cleanup Program. This is a great program, exactly what it says, to clean up our streams. Some of our streams have, it's amazing what junk and trash can accumulate in our streams. This grant program helps groups get out there and pull a lot of things out of the water. It's amazing what we can find, and I guess sad what we can find in our waterways. Next slide. And then finally, we have the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. This is a program where folks can get out onto the water, learn a bunch of protocols, and have a lot of fun collecting kind of the pulse of their lake. So we have many water quality parameters, habitat parameters, and then also invasive species early detection protocols. Next slide. So all of these three programs are underneath MiCorps. If you are interested in this and want to learn more, please visit us at micorps.net. This program is brought to you by the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, Michigan State University Extension, the Huron River Watershed Council, and the Michigan Lakes and Streams Associations. So thank you for that. And then just moving on now to our presentation for today, Jake Sawecki speaking on aquatic food webs, how do fish decide what to eat and why? Jake is a PhD student working with Dr. Brian Roth, studying changes in predatory fish diets within Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. He has a bachelor's in science in biology from the University of Michigan Dearborn and a master's in biology from Central Michigan University in 2019. Jake, we're all excited, I think, to hear from you, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Eric. I am also excited to share a bit about my research and a bit about fish in general, which I have grown to love throughout my entire lifetime, and am lucky enough to now research at Michigan State. So before I get started, just a tiny bit about me. First and foremost, I am a scientist. That picture on the far right is me with a pile of round gobi that were consumed by a lake trout in Lake Michigan. So the majority of my time is spent either digging through fish stomachs, analyzing data, and giving presentations about the results that I'm finding. But I'm also a nature lover, which is how I got into fisheries and wildlife. During the summer, I love to raise monarch butterflies. That one in the top left is the 100th butterfly that I raised and released last year. I'm overall just a fish enthusiast. I have 6 fish tanks in my apartment. I wish I could get more, but I do live on the 3rd floor of my apartment, so I'm kind of limited there, unfortunately. And I'm an avid angler. Largemouth bass are my favorite fish, and I love fishing for them. They have a very diverse diet, which I think is really interesting. Although I don't research them now, and I'm researching salmon, they'll always be my favorite fish, and I will always be interested in going out and catching more. Now, Eric covered a little bit about my educational background. I grew up in Michigan. I've actually lived in Michigan my whole life. I'm from Livonia, Michigan, and then I went to the University of Michigan, Dearborn, where I studied biology. Didn't really get into any research there, but then I went 2 hours north to Central Michigan University, where I studied a cichlid fish known as Astadotilapia bertoni. They're from Lake Tanganyika in Africa. And they are just kind of just use them as a model species. So I didn't really get into any fish stuff until 2 years later, after starting my master's when I graduated, where I ended up at Michigan State, where I now study the diets of salmon, trout, and walleye in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. So the research that I'm doing now is the Huron Michigan Predator Diet Study. And essentially, the goals of this study are to see what salmon, trout, and walleye are consuming in Lakes Huron and Michigan. So I know a lot about fish diets. I've been studying them for 2 years now. And our goal is to look at seasonal trends. So are fish consuming different foods at different times of the year? Spatial trends to see if fish are consuming the same food in the northern parts of the lakes as they are in the southern part of the lake, or are they consuming different foods between the 2 different lakes? And this data that we're collecting is going to be valuable for updating forecasting models because, one, it provides direct evidence of consumption. So if we see, for example, a round gobi in the stomach of a lake trout, then we know that lake trout are eating round gobi because the only way that it could have gotten there was that the lake trout consumed it. And then this also helps us figure out if there are enough prey fish in the lakes to support the number of predators in the lakes. So for those of you that may not know, salmon are stocked into Lake Huron and Lake Michigan on an annual basis, as well as lake trout. And if we don't have enough prey fish in the lakes, then the populations are going to die and they cannot support the number of fish that we're putting in. So that's what this data helps shed light on. So we know whether or not we can put more salmon in the lake or not. Now, over the past couple of years, I've looked through a lot of different fish stomachs, and I can tell you that they eat a lot of different things. That right there is a pile of round gobi, and that is a bloater. This is a rainbow smelt. We've seen large walleye in stomachs, plenty of bugs. That right there is just a hoverfly. That is actually sea lamprey teeth right there, the only one we've ever found. A very large smallmouth bass. This is a bunch of alewife, which is a very common prey item. A mud puppy. And then sometimes we even find prey items that aren't really considered prey items. So this is unfortunately a Coca-Cola wrapper that we found in the stomach of a lake trout. So it's not always food that they're consuming. They may accidentally consume other things like garbage. And I often find rocks in the stomach of lake trout as well, because they're picking up round gobi from the bottom of the lake and they're accidentally consuming those rocks. So with all of those things eaten, how do fish decide exactly what to eat? They obviously are eating a diversity of different things. And how did they decide what ones to eat versus what ones to avoid? Well, realistically, fish aren't really just opening up a kitchen cupboard and choosing the most appealing snack. The truth is, they're probably not making as much of a conscious decision as we'd like to think. So that lure that you're using, it might not necessarily be the fact that it looks the most appetizing. It's kind of a matter of a couple of different factors. So the first factor and the most important factor is that fish can't swallow anything typically that's larger than their head. This is an example of a fish that tried. and it was not successful. The fish was only 7.5 inches long, and it tried to consume something that was 34 inches long, which clearly didn't go well and resulted in the fish dying. So not ideal to try and consume something that is too large to fit in the stomach of the fish. The reason for this is that fish have something known as a gape limit. So measured by that red line there, they can only fit a fish of a certain size or a prey item of a certain size within their mouth. And if they can't swallow it, they're probably not going to be able to eat it. Fish typically do not chew their food. They swallow their food whole, and they usually swallow it head first. So if they're not able to do that, they're probably not going to be able to consume that prey item. And a general rule of thumb is that fish can consume prey items that are up to about 40% of their total length. So if the prey item gets larger than that, then a fish probably cannot eat it. And we call that reaching a size refuge. So if prey get beyond that 40% of the total length of the predator, then they've reached a size refuge where they're no longer at risk of being consumed by those predators, and they can survive and reproduce and create a sustainable population of those prey fish. Now, another factor that influences what a fish will eat or what a fish will not eat is just genetics and morphology. So fish are born a certain way, and their body type often tells us what kind of predator they are or what type of food that they may eat. So this fish here is a northern pike. You're probably all pretty familiar with the northern pike. They're in many of the lakes within Michigan. And if you know northern pike well, you may know that they have sharp teeth. I have accidentally stuck my hand in the mouth of a pike before, and it does not feel good. You pull out a bloody hand because those sharp teeth are used for tearing, they're used for grasping, and they're used for cutting. Most of the time, they're actually used for grasping a prey fish. So they'll catch a prey fish, and then within their mouth, they actually have to manipulate that prey fish to turn it around so that they can swallow it head first. And these teeth are great for doing that. And this is an indication that these type of fish are feeding mostly on other fish. They eat almost exclusively fish species, which makes them a piscivore, which is a fish that eats pretty much only other fish. Now, there are other types of teeth, such as these on a sheep's head. And this is actually a fish from the ocean. It is a saltwater fish. And they have teeth that kind of look like human teeth. They're not very sharp. They're pretty dull. And they're used for plucking and crushing. So like I said, most fish don't chew their food, but some do. And this type of fish is typically eating things like crustaceans in the ocean or barnacles. So it will pluck barnacles off of dock posts in marinas or off piers, and it will eat them. And these teeth are adapted so that that fish is able to do that. And then another type of teeth are actually teeth that aren't even necessarily in the mouth. These teeth are back in the throat of the fish. They're called pharyngeal teeth. And these type of teeth are actually used for grinding aquatic vegetation. So this fish pictured here is a grass carp, which eats a lot of aquatic vegetation, and it grinds up that vegetation so that it can get nutrients out of it. It doesn't just swallow them whole. Very few fish do this. Being a vegetarian as a fish is not very common at all. I think about 5%, maybe probably less than 5% of fish are actually fish that eat plants. The rest eat mostly fish. I'd say about 90% of fish actually consume other fish species. So then another important factor when it comes to the feeding ecology of a fish is that prey have to be available for a fish to consume. Put simply, a fish cannot eat what a fish cannot find. And those are the three main driving forces that are going to determine what a fish can eat. So number one is size. Number two is morphology and genetics. And number three is the availability of prey. If you can't find it, it can't eat it. So let's walk through some of that a bit farther with an example of the Huron Michigan predator diet study that I'm doing on Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. So first of all, just one thing to note is that Pacific salmon, which are in the Great Lakes, this right here is a king salmon pictured are large. So they typically don't have a problem consuming many of the prey fish in the Great Lakes because many of the prey fish are not larger than 40% of the length of the king salmon in the Great Lakes. So size, not necessarily an issue, but they can't eat anything that gets too large. They have very sharp teeth. If you've never seen the mouth of a king salmon before, here it is. It's not very pretty. There are a lot of sharp teeth in that fish, and that should provide another clue that king salmon are consuming other fish species because they have those sharp teeth, which are used for gripping, tearing, grasping, and then manipulating those fish to turn them around in their mouth so that then they can swallow them head first. And then the last thing, and probably the most interesting when it comes to the salmon in the Great Lakes, is prey availability. And I'll spend a little bit more time talking about this than I did for the first two because those are relatively straightforward. So back in the 1940s, there's this small prey fish known as the alewife that invaded the Great Lakes from the Atlantic Ocean. So the alewife is in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario. It's in actually all the Great Lakes, and it is an invasive species. And when they invaded the Great Lakes, they exploded in population size because at that time, the number one predator in the Great Lakes, which was the lake trout, historically they're the top predator, the native predator, was at an all-time low in population size because of one, overfishing. Humans were harvesting too many lake trout, and two, the invasive sea lamprey. So sea lamprey parasitize lake trout, and they'll attach to the side of the lake trout, and they'll suck the fluids out of the lake trout, which can cause death to the lake trout, which happened very frequently. So there were no predators to control these alewife. And in the absence of predators, these alewife began to reproduce over and over again. And eventually it got to the point where there were so many of these alewife in the Great Lakes that they were just a super readily available prey item. And they started causing issues, not only for other fish within the lakes because they competed with other native prey fish, but they also caused issues for humans. So because of things like disease outbreaks and just the fact that there were so many of these alewife in the Great Lakes competing for food, there would be large die-offs. So alewife would die off in massive numbers, and they would litter piers like it's pictured here. They'd wash up on beaches. And this really had damaging effects to the coastline of Michigan and tourism, as beaches were no longer seen as an attraction, but people avoided beaches because, as you can imagine, they probably didn't smell very good and people didn't want to be there. They wanted to be away from the fish. They actually even brought in bulldozers to remove some of the fish from these beaches. That's how many were washing onto shore. But thankfully, there was a solution for this. And it wasn't just bulldozers. So some smart scientists back in the 1960s decided, well, salmon from the Pacific Ocean and salmon from the Atlantic Ocean might be able to survive in the Great Lakes because although they live in salt water, they swim into fresh water to spawn. They spawn in rivers. So they brought them to the Great Lakes. They took Pacific salmon, which is the Chinook salmon, the coho salmon, and the pink salmon, and they brought them to the Great Lakes. And they also got Atlantic salmon from the Atlantic Ocean and brought them to the Great Lakes. And this was a huge success. This created a multi-billion-dollar fishing industry in the Great Lakes region as people came from all over the place to go on charter boats to fish for these king salmon because they got up to 30 pounds. They were really exciting to catch, and people enjoy eating salmon as well. So people came to Michigan, stayed in hotels, went to restaurants, and then went on these fishing trips. And charter captains were making a living by taking people out fishing. So success number one was that it stimulated the economy in the Great Lakes region. The second success was that it actually resulted in control of those alewife. So this graph here is from Lake Michigan, and it's diets of different trout and salmon from in Lake Michigan from 1973 to 1982. On the left-hand side is salmon and trout that are under 30 centimeters. On the right-hand side are salmon and trout that are over 30 centimeters. And the black in these pie charts is alewife. And as you can see, for the larger fish, they almost every season, so we have spring, summer, fall, consumed over 50% alewife as part of their diet. And this was great because it caused the population of alewife to decline, and they were doing their job and controlling the population of that invasive species. However, over time, prey biomass began to decline. So it was great for a while, but as we got closer into the 2000s, the prey biomass really started to go down. And if you pay attention to the gray here, that is alewife. And in 2003, still quite a bit, but then the population kind of drops pretty far down. And this was, as you can see by the last graph, the number one prey item for many of those different prey fish. So unfortunately, with a reduction in prey species, we probably can't have as many fish in the lakes as we would like. But what ultimately caused that prey availability to go down? Well, the simple answer is probably the salmon. The salmon came in, did their job, consumed all those alewife, and then people harvested the salmon. So that'd be the simple answer, and it would make the most sense. But realistically, there's probably a combination of several different things because aquatic food webs are really complex, and the Great Lakes have undergone a number of different changes due to invasive species, human impacts since the 1960s, when these salmon were first introduced into the Great Lakes. So if we look at an aquatic food web, this is a very simplistic view of what is happening in an aquatic ecosystem. So at the very bottom of the food web, we have phytoplankton, which are in high numbers, hopefully, but they're starting to go down in the Great Lakes. And then there are zooplankton, which consume phytoplankton. Small fish consume the zooplankton, so that would be like the alewife consuming the zooplankton, competing with other native fish species for those zooplankton. And then those small fish would be consumed by the larger fish like Chinook salmon. Now, like I said, though, this is a really simplistic version of an aquatic food web, and there's realistically a lot more that's going on. So I'm just going to go over a couple examples of what other things are probably happening. So first of all, small fish are probably also consuming other small fish. There's research out there as far as the Great Lakes go that show that alewife actually prey on larval stages of native prey fish in the Great Lakes. So not only are they competing with native prey fish, they're also suppressing native prey fish populations because they're consuming their offspring. Additionally, these small fish can consume the offspring of larger fish. One fish in particular in the Great Lakes is the round gobi, which is an invasive species that consume the eggs of many of the native fish species like lake trout, which in turn is directly reducing the number of those large fish because they're preying on the offspring or the eggs of those large fish. And then large fish can also consume smaller versions of themselves. Cannibalism is very common amongst fish. They don't see their offspring as their own offspring. They see them as another meal most of the time and are likely going to consume them if they are given the opportunity. Now, we can also think of some external factors, such as terrestrial inverts. So small fish will eat a lot of terrestrial inverts. Same with large fish. And a good example of this in the Great Lakes are steelhead or rainbow trout, which will feed on the top of the water on scum lines where a lot of terrestrial inverts are hanging out. We open a lot of rainbow trout stomachs in the lab, and we see a lot of terrestrial inverts. Flies are particularly one of the most common. Now, other outside sources, such as birds or large mammals, like birds like a bald eagle or a cormorant, are going to consume those small fish as well. They're able to consume large fish, as long as the fish isn't too large, of course. And that is going to have another factor on those food webs, as they're going to be taking nutrients from the aquatic ecosystem and taking them elsewhere. And they're probably going to deposit those nutrients somewhere on the land, and those nutrients are no longer being recycled in that aquatic food web. Now, in the Great Lakes, there is a species of zooplankton that is invasive, known as the spiny water flea. And these zooplankton actually directly contribute to the decline of native zooplankton levels because they prey on smaller zooplankton. Spiny water flea are a species of zooplankton that is particularly large when it comes to zooplankton, and they have a large spine, hence the name spiny water flea, which makes them really difficult for small prey fish to consume. So they're not even really contributing to the zooplankton population that can be consumed by the small fish because that large spine makes them, one, difficult to consume, and two, hard to digest for those small prey fish. Now, another invasive species that is well known in the Great Lakes region and many inland lakes in Michigan are the dreissenid mussels. So the zebra mussels and the quagga mussels are filtering the water in the Great Lakes. You may have heard that the Great Lakes are becoming clearer, which sounds like it's a good thing because we can see deeper into the water, but it's actually really not a good thing at all because what they're doing is filtering out the phytoplankton. And then by removing that phytoplankton, there's no longer food available for the zooplankton to consume. And then one other species that I already mentioned that's popular well, not popular, but well known in the Great Lakes as an invader is the round gobi. And the round gobi feed on zooplankton, they feed on inverts, and they also feed on these dreissenid mussels. So the nice thing about round gobi is that they're able to consume those zebra mussels or those quagga mussels that are filtering out that phytoplankton so they can get that energy from that phytoplankton. And then they can transfer that energy to higher trophic levels because larger fish can consume the round gobi. So although the round gobi is considered invasive in the Great Lakes, it might be a saving grace because energy that is getting trapped in the zebra mussels can then be transferred up the food web if round gobi are able to consume those zebra mussels and then pass that energy on to larger fish like lake trout. So with all that information, what actually probably caused prey availability to decline in the Great Lakes? Well, it's a combination of several events. First of all, it's the stocking of Pacific salmon and the recovery of lake trout. So lake trout populations in the Great Lakes have rebounded, and they're consuming many alewife as well as the Pacific salmon. The invasion of the Great Lakes by the zebra and quagga mussels are filtering out that water, causing the phytoplankton levels to decline, causing zooplankton levels to decline, which means there's not enough prey available for the alewife. So that has had an effect. The third factor that probably has had an effect is the spiny water flea, which are also preying on those smaller zooplankton in the Great Lakes. And then there's the overall decline of zooplankton biomass because of those two previous factors really has probably caused those alewife levels to decline in the Great Lakes so that they're no longer available to be consumed by predators. So what happens when the prey disappears? Well, this is a graph from Lake Huron. So I did switch here because this graph from Lake Huron really is a good representation of what could happen in Lake Michigan because Lake Huron pretty much has almost zero alewife left. There are some there, but in 2003, a lot of them disappeared. There was a crash in the population of prey fish due to the reasons that I just mentioned. So this graph here shows how many salmon were harvested and how many trout were harvested in Lake Huron over the years. As we can see, almost immediately following that crash in prey fish populations, which happened in 2003, the number of fish being harvested almost dropped to nothing. It dropped very, very low, which fishing effort, which is that red line, did drop as well. So not as many people were fishing or spending as much time fishing, but because of the absence of prey, the fish didn't have anything to eat, their populations declined, and less of them were harvested. So prey availability plays a huge role in what fish are going to consume. Now this here is a graph from 2020 of diets of fish in Lake Huron, because prey disappearing is going to have different effects on different fish depending on what type of fish we're looking at. So certain species are known as what we call specialists, and those are species like the Chinook or king salmon and the coho salmon. And if we look at this graph here, we see that CHS, which is the second bar from the left, has a lot of that light blue color, which represents alewife. Although alewife populations in Lake Huron have almost disappeared, king salmon are feeding almost exclusively on alewife. They almost refuse to switch to something else. The same can be said for coho salmon, although that sample size of 9 is very small. And now there's other fish that are more generalist species, so they're not as picky, and they're willing to transition to different prey sources when the availability of their preferred prey fish, such as the alewife, disappears. So if we look at the lake trout, we can see that it's eating about 50% rainbow smelt, which is that dark red color. That peach/orange color is round gobi. And then they consume a couple other different types of fish. But really, once that alewife disappeared, they were able to make a switch to new food. Same with walleye, which feed a lot on yellow perch, feed a lot on round gobi and rainbow smelt as well. So those generalist fish, pretty capable of switching to new food when their preferred fish disappears. But for fish like the king salmon and the coho salmon, the disappearance of their preferred prey fish, such as the alewife, could be detrimental to those populations. So then how does this apply to inland lakes and streams? The Great Lakes are very large, and there are many more influences on those than there are for inland lakes and streams. So a few things that we need to remember are that fish can only consume food that is, 1, readily available, and 2, small enough to fit in their mouth and be swallowed by the fish. So again, the general rule is that prey fish have to be 40% or less of the total fish length to be consumed. So then if we think of a lake ecosystem, we can think of our top predators, in many cases being largemouth bass, and we can think of our small fish being bluegill. These two fish co-evolved with one another. Largemouth bass have been consuming bluegill for a very, very, very long time, and this has been well known, and there are many studies published about it. And what can happen is that in a given year, there might be a natural disaster that causes poor recruitment for bluegill. The bluegill aren't able to reproduce, and it causes their population to go down. Now, what happens when their population goes down is that there's less food available for those largemouth bass. So what they have to do is now look elsewhere. They could look to terrestrial food items, such as frogs, mice, maybe baby ducks, if the bass are large enough, or they can look for other aquatic food items like fathead minnows, if those exist within the ecosystem. However, if the bass in the ecosystem are too small to consume any of the terrestrial food items, assume we have giant bullfrogs for whatever reason and the bass cannot consume them, or if there are no other fish within the ecosystem, like these fathead minnows, then the population of bass or the other large fish is going to decline. There's going to be less to catch, or we're going to get stunted fish, which aren't going to grow as large, and it's going to be problematic for the ecosystem. Now, similar to this, humans can have impacts in the same way that natural disasters can have impacts. One example would be overharvesting. So there are harvest limits set on these fish because if too many are harvested, there's not going to be enough left to reproduce to then provide food for the larger predator fish that exist within that ecosystem. So if overharvesting bluegill occurs, populations of bluegill are going to go down. The bass is going to have to look for frogs or minnows. And if those aren't available, the population of those bass in that lake are going to go down. Another human impact that many people don't think about is actually climate change and how this can affect food webs. So as temperatures are getting warmer and warmer globally on an annual basis, what's happening is that temperatures are causing phytoplankton blooms to occur earlier and earlier in the year. And this is really problematic because zooplankton don't respond to temperature. Their population increases based on photoperiods. So the amount of time that the light is out during the day. As that gets longer and longer, as we move into the spring and the summer, we're going to get increased populations of zooplankton. Well, the problem here is that although temperature is going up and causing phytoplankton to go up, it's happening too soon. It's happening before the zooplankton are there to consume it, and then it's dying, and the zooplankton are missing out on all that food. So zooplankton levels are going to go down, which means there's less food for the small fish. So there's a decrease in populations of fish like bluegill and a decrease in then the populations of the large fish like the largemouth bass. And then one other effect that humans introduce accidentally, hopefully, invasive species is how invasive species can impact these food webs. So one that is very common in Michigan lakes, we've already talked about it, is the zebra mussel or the dreisseniid mussel. And they filter out the water, which reduces levels of phytoplankton, which then is less food for zooplankton, less food for the small fish, less food for the large fish. And then therefore we lose out on growth for the large fish, or they die off because there's no food for them to consume. So then how does this vary by lake to lake? Now the answer to that is actually pretty simple. And it's the same reason that it varies from streams to lakes. And it just depends on different species assemblages and different ecosystems. So in a river, you can probably imagine that there's more of the land touching the river. So there's more terrestrial input. Whereas in a lake, there's less terrestrial input because there's less water touching land than there is in a river. So in one lake, we might have largemouth bass, fathead minnows, and bluegill. So that would determine that bass could either eat both of those, one of those. In another lake, we might have pike, green sunfish, bluegill, minnows, perch, and bass. So there's a different variety of food that the bass can consume, and it may consume different foods based on the time of year. And then the pike as well plays a factor because it might consume some of the smaller juvenile bass. Might have another ecosystem that is just pike and bluegill and green sunfish. And then if we're really lucky, like a lake that I discovered a couple of years ago, there was a lake with just largemouth bass, rainbow trout, and goldfish. As you can imagine, the bass in this lake grew very fast and always had full bellies because they were just consuming tons and tons of goldfish. Now, this wasn't a great lake because goldfish are invasive and should not be let go. But the type of food available influenced what they were consuming, which directly influenced their growth, their reproduction, and how many fish there were available to catch within that lake. So then what can we do about this? Well, number one is we can reduce our carbon footprint to reduce those rising temperatures, to prevent climate change from offsetting that bloom in phytoplankton with the increase in zooplankton populations. We can obey harvest limits. We don't want to remove too many prey fish because then there's no more prey available for the larger fish to consume. And we can make sure we're doing our job to not transfer invasive species from lake to lake or introduce them by accident or let our pet goldfish go, things like that to prevent invasive species from entering our aquatic ecosystems. So then what's the bottom line? Well, number one is that aquatic food webs are complex. There's a lot of moving parts and external influences, such as invasive species, humans, just what fish assemblage exists within that water. And a lot of times humans influence that. Humans have been influencing these aquatic food webs for years in Michigan. So if we think about invasive species in the Great Lakes, a lot of these came over in the ballast water of ships. People might have let their pet goldfish go. We introduced salmon on purpose. And if you really think about it, that dramatically changed the food web in the Great Lakes. It introduced a new top predator that could consume many of the different prey fish in the lake. And then setting harvest limits to make sure that there's prey available for the fish to consume. And then remember that there are three main influencers when it comes to prey choice in fish. They're not necessarily thinking that they're going to eat what tastes best on a particular day, but they're eating things based on their size, which has got to be less than 40% of their total length as a general rule. The availability of those prey, you can't eat what you can't find. And then genetics. Certain fish have certain morphology, which allows them to consume certain things that other fish are not able to consume. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have now. I put the Huron Michigan Predator Diet Study page on here. I've put my Twitter handle on here, my email, so that if there are any questions that I'm not able to answer today, you can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to answer them in the future at any point. So I'm constantly posting on Huron Michigan Predator Diet Study Facebook page, and I'm happy to answer by email or Twitter as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. That was great. A lot of good information. Please, if you have any questions, there are a few already in the Q&A, but if you have any on your mind, please click on that Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer your question in time. I also want to mention before we get to Q&A is that this webinar has been recorded, or is being recorded right now as we speak, and will be posted on the MiCorps website within a week. And that again is micorps.net. And then also to mention, this is a series, and there's another presentation coming up, and that is on March 21st at 3 o'clock, and that is Natural Lakes versus Reservoirs and Corresponding Freshwater Characteristics. Okay, so let's get into some questions. Okay, what is the teeth morphology of the ground gobi that allow them to consume quagga and zebra mussels?
That is a great question, and I don't have a great answer for it. I will say that when we do find them in the stomachs of the fish, so typically lake trout eat a lot around gobi, they have really large jaws. That my assumption is that they're very good for crushing the outer shell of those zebra and quagga mussels, and that's how they're able to consume those. I don't see sharp teeth in round gobi mouths, but I'm assuming those large jaws are powerful enough to crush the zebra and quagga mussels.
Talking about round gobi, you mentioned that so lake trout had been shifting towards eating round gobi, and you also mentioned they were generalists. My question there is, so is there one more part, and that's behavior? So round gobi showed up on the scene. Did it take a few years to seeing round gobi in their stomachs, or was it immediate?
It took a few years, and it's actually becoming even more relevant in their stomachs. So over time, even in the data that I have collected from 2017 through 2021 now, or 2022? No, only through 2021. We've seen increasing numbers of round gobi in the stomachs of lake trout, and that might be because there's reduced numbers of now alewife in the Great Lakes, which were their preferred prey item. But now that the round gobi are there and they're more available, the lake trout may be shifting to a diet that consists of more round gobi, and it's also seasonally dependent. So when they overlap in habitat with round gobi more, which is in the spring, when the lake trout are in shallower, we see a higher proportion of round gobi in the diets.
Perfect. And we'll just keep going with some round gobi questions. Is it true that round gobis will eat large fish eggs like smallmouth during the spawn?
Yes, that is true. And that's why round gobi are particularly an issue, because they like to consume fish eggs, which is going to reduce our number of top predators.
Okay. And great questions, everyone, so far. So keep them rolling. I know you mentioned that lake trout are vulnerable to parasitism by lamprey, but why was the decision made to introduce salmon to the Great Lakes? Why not just stock more lake trout?
That's a great question. And I wish I was back sitting in that room back in the 1960s where they decided to bring the salmon over here, because I actually thought it was a brilliant idea. And I don't know the exact answer to that, but I can provide a guess. Number one is that it created an economy or an opportunity for economic growth in the state of Michigan by introducing a new sport fishery, which gained a lot of traction. People wanted to catch those large king salmon. And number two is that salmon are very prolific, especially the king salmon. They grow very fast. They can grow from a tiny little baby up to 30 pounds in 3 years. So they are consuming a large number of alewife. So the fastest way to reduce that alewife population was with a fish that was going to consume many, many, many of those alewife.
Okay. You noted that some of the salmon species feed almost exclusively on alewife. Has there been any studies suggesting how they are able to pick out the alewife out of the other species of prey fish?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Because the Chinook or the king salmon is almost exclusively feeding on alewife. And it might not necessarily be a matter of them picking and choosing what prey fish they eat. It might be a matter of they overlap with the habitats that the alewife are in. So king salmon typically are swimming in the middle and feeding in the middle of the water column. So if that's where the alewife are hanging out, they're more likely to be consumed. But as far as I'm aware, there's no particular study where they have looked to see if they're choosing alewife for any reason. It might be that the alewife just swims slower. It might be that the alewife are more of a schooling fish, so it's easier to swim through a school and catch a bunch of them. But one interesting aspect in Lake Michigan is that the bloater population, which is just another prey fish in the Great Lakes, it's actually a native prey fish. The biomass of those is actually higher than alewife, but for whatever reason, the Chinook salmon are still consuming alewife and almost not touching bloater whatsoever. And nobody really knows why, but that's what we're seeing in the diets, at least.
Okay, moving on to another species, smelt. What caused the decline in smelt population in Michigan? Do we know?
Yeah, so the decline in smelt population was actually a result of a lot of the same things that caused the alewife population to decline. So the fish, one, were eating a lot of the smelt, and two, the zebra mussels and quagga mussels filtering out that phytoplankton, which reduced the zooplankton levels. There was no more food for the rainbow smelt. So the major driver was probably the latter, where the water is being filtered more, the phytoplankton levels are declining, and the zooplankton levels are therefore declining. So there's just not as much food for those smelt anymore.
Okay, just moving inland for a little bit. So is stocking fish in inland lakes a good solution for addressing food limitations?
It can be, if done the right way, it can be. It would depend on so for the most part, when I think of stocking, they typically stock predator fish. I'm assuming this question is referring to stocking prey fish.
Yes.
As an alternative. So that can work. And I mentioned size refuge. So if enough prey fish can be stocked in the lake so they can grow to a size where they're large enough to no longer be consumed because they get above that roughly 40% of the total length of the predator, they can reach that size refuge and reproduce in the lake, and then it's naturally providing food every year when they're reproducing for those predator fish. So it can work. You just have to stock enough of those prey fish to reach a point where they're reaching that size refuge so that they can sustain their own population.
You mentioned how certain invasive species in inland lakes can impact the food web and in the Great Lakes. Can you talk a little bit about invasive aquatic plants and how that may impact the food web and then therefore our predator fish?
That's a really good question, and one that I might not have a great answer. When I think as far as prey availability, I know some invasive plants. I know Eurasian milfoil was a plant that I had in the lake that my mom has a cabin in up north, and the fishing got really, really bad, and the bluegill population started to thrive. And my hypothesis there is that it offered more hiding spaces and made them more difficult for the larger fish to consume. So prey availability actually declined because of this invasive plant. But that's about as far as my knowledge goes with that.
Okay, going back with the thing of prey biomass in inland lakes. So for inland lakes, is there a way to survey the prey biomass to understand stocking needs? Is this mainly done at the small and large fish surveys?
yes, there is a way to assess the fish populations, how many fish are in there. A lot of studies use things called fyke nets. Gill nets are often used, and they get a sample of the fish over a certain time period or over a certain area. And they can use that information to figure out, number one, how well are the fish doing? Are they are populations of a certain fish overabundant, underabundant, etc. So they can sample the fish. I have not ever been involved in anything like that, but I know that that is a method that they do use. As far as how they use that data, I am not positive, but they do sample in that way using fyke and gill nets to assess the fish populations. And I know that they do that on inland lakes. I don't know how they choose which lakes to do it at. I don't know how often they do it, but I do know that that does happen on inland lakes within Michigan.
And when we talk about looking at the fish population in lakes and we want to enhance one thing or another, and we mentioned stocking or changing something directly, but can you talk maybe about habitat and how looking and thinking about habitat can maybe create a more resilient, sustainable population or community of fish?
Yeah, that's a great point, actually, because you can stock as many fish as you want, but if you don't provide them the habitat to survive and reproduce, you're going to have to keep restocking fish as they die or they're captured and harvested, right? So this is relatively new that people are starting to talk about this, and it kind of applies to streams more so than I've heard it applied to lakes, is that we need to make sure that we have suitable habitat for these fish to live in so that they can survive and reproduce on their own, so that we don't have to go in every other year, assess the population, and then spend money on adding more fish to the lake. Whereas we could, as an alternative, spend some money to repair some of the habitat and make suitable habitat for spawning. But a lot of times that doesn't work, because on a lot of the lakes in Michigan that I'm familiar with, at least, they try and use as much of that waterfront as possible for houses. So a lot of that suitable habitat where you get a lot of fallen trees or a lot of aquatic vegetation is missing from those particular lakes. So stocking has become one of the options to kind of get around the fact that maybe not all lakes are suited for restoring habitat when they're more so being used for people that want to use them recreationally and have a nice sandy beach in front of their place.
Interesting. And kind of maybe let's even expand that idea a little bit further. You mentioned climate and fish, and now linking in habitat. Is there a way that, let's say it's a lake that's in good condition with habitat and stuff, but climate is changing and it's warming. Is there something that we all can do, or as managers or as individuals, to help kind of create a resilient fish community?
With climate, that's a really tough question, because it almost feels like, and my view on it is might not be the right view. I almost feel as if to some extent it's out of the control at this. We're in too deep, to the point where we maybe are getting to the point where the cold water fish that we have may no longer be able to exist within some of the ecosystems. So an example of cold water fish is just like rainbow trout, brook trout, are cold water fish. If it gets too warm for them, they're not going to be able to survive, just because cold water holds more oxygen, and these are fish that need more oxygen. So as temperatures are rising, the water is getting warmer. There's less oxygen in that water. So at that point, I don't know how much we can do as a fisheries management, in terms of fisheries management, to prevent that. It seems like it has to come on a much larger global scale.
Thanks. Yeah, we're seeing some of these larger scale stuff on looking in the watersheds and thinking about the lake on the land kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned brook trout. So here's a question, and this is more in streams and rivers. In the last couple of years, I've only been catching undersized brook trout in streams and rivers. other fishermen are telling me the same thing. Is this a general observation, or am I doing something wrong?
Great question. I've never caught a brook trout. So the fact that you're catching brook trout, you're doing better than me. I can't speak on the population for brook trout. All I can say is that if you're seeing smaller sizes than typical, it's possible that there's an overabundance of brook trout. They're competing for food with one another, or there's just a lack of food, so they're not growing as quickly. But I'm not familiar with brook trout populations. I wish I was. I'd like to catch one someday.
Just thinking about discussing some preferred diets. What is the preferred diet for crappie?
Crappie have a large mouth, which kind of provides a hint. That's that morphology providing a hint about what they eat. They like to eat a lot of small fish. So small fish, they'll eat minnows. They're pretty much exclusively piscivores. So they eat a lot of small fish.
Hence the crappie minnow for fishing for them.
Yep.
This is a question regarding how other invasives might feed on other invasives, and just some kind of a discussion on that. Would other potential invasives like grass carp feed on mussels? I'm assuming maybe dry-seeded mussels, but not sure.
It's possible. And even in lake trout, we see mussels in their stomach, and they're not intentionally feeding on them. I don't know much about the diet of fish other than piscivorous fish. So grass carp, I know that they eat plants. I'm not familiar if they consume mussels or not, or whether or not that's accidental as they're consuming plant matter off the bottom.
I would just like to mention that grass carp are highly invasive and have huge negative impacts, and are illegal to have in Michigan, are not allowed. They have a huge impact on their ecosystem, negative impact. We're getting close to the end. Here's a fun one, but also can have some serious information. What advice do you have for anglers, given your in-depth knowledge of fish food choices?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one because it depends what you're fishing for, really. When you're fishing, if you think about it, the first fish you catch, my advice would be if it's not catch and release, if you're going to be harvesting these fish to consume, look inside the stomach, see what the fish are eating. If you can match as closely as you can to what those fish are eating, then you're going to do a pretty good job. You're going to be able to catch more fish. So I would always recommend to look inside the fish and see what they're eating. And there's ways to do this without killing the fish. I believe it's called gastric lavage. I have never done it before, but I would like to do it because I am exclusively a catch and release fisherman. So I don't really look very often at what they're eating, but bass from time to time will spit up their food as they're being caught. So if you're looking at what they're eating, you're going to do well and catch a bunch of fish.
I'd like to call that technique puke bags. That's the vacuum of it going into a vacuum pack.
Yep. Basically making the fish throw up.
Yeah. Well, excellent. Thanks, Jake. That was awesome. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for all the additional information as we pick your brain with all sorts of questions, fish diet. That concludes our presentation today. Again, this is recorded and will be up on the MiCorps website. If you're interested in MiCorps and learning more about maybe having a hand in understanding our water quality in our state, in our streams and lakes, visit micorps.net. Thank you very much and have a great day.